Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I'm so delighted to be here today with author Leila Rafei. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, truly my pleasure. Leila Rafei was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area and now lives in New York. Spring, this fantastic book I have in my hands, is her first novel, and that is what we're going to talk about today. So, Leila, please tell me all about Spring.
Well, spring, I also have a copy.
Beautiful.
It's still kind of surreal holding it, but spring is um, it's a story that's inspired by the Egyptian revolution in 2011, also known as part of the Arab Spring. I was actually living in Cairo at the time, and I just found the time so inspiring and such a ecstatic moment that I knew that if I was ever going to write something, it had to be somewhat related to that. So that kind of laid the groundwork for the story. And then the other parts of it, like the personal storylines, kind of fell into place years after that. So it was all kind of like a gradual process.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tell me a little bit more about those personal storylines. Who are the characters that we follow in the book?
Well, the main character is Sami. He is a young Egyptian guy who um, has an American girlfriend and is hiding that relation. He feels very conflicted about the relationship and is trying to figure out what he wants. At the same time, this whole uprising is happening. So he's kind of figuring out his place in the world in personally and politically. Um, and then another character is his mother, actually, who she lives outside of Cairo, and she's kind of neurotic and suspects things, but is desperately trying to find out what's happening. And she might be my favorite character to write about. And then the third main character is a woman named Jamila, who is a refugee from Sudan, and she works for Sami's girlfriend as a housekeeper. And Jamila is her role is kind of as an observer. She kind of watches what's happening around her. She senses these weird tensions. She also has a unique perspective about the political situation. So she's kind of an interesting neutral character.
Oh, fascinating. Well, a really interesting trio. And so you mentioned that you were in Cairo during, kind of the Arab Spring and the Egyptian Revolution. Tell me a little bit more about that. So why were you there at that time? And what did you learn as you watched it all unfold? And how did that inspire the book?
Well, I was there when I was doing my master's degree at the American University in Cairo. I was studying Middle East studies. And it's funny, before the revolution, we were learning about other revolutions in the Middle East, and then amazingly got this experience. And I feel so lucky to have experienced that. I think that something I learned, not that I ever thought otherwise, but it was actually such a positive and, fun time that, of course, there was danger, there was violence, people got seriously injured or killed, but I think at its core, it was a really positive movement. And I sensed from a lot of people that I know who participated, it was just a very hopeful time, and people felt really good in general. That was what my perception was.
Very good. And so how did watching that, how did that process of seeing that unfold then eventually become the book?
Um, I don't know. I mean, it was, I guess, by accident, it happened. I was living in an apartment with a few friends of mine, and the apartment luckily was close to downtown where all of the action was happening during the revolution. So we watched a lot of it from our balcony. We also participated a couple times, actually went down to Tahrir Square. So it was kind of weird. It was this thing that first kind of started, and at first there was kind of this electricity in the air because there was like news about uprisings in other countries, and everybody was kind of talking about what would happen in Egypt. And so like I felt like this edginess to the air for a while, and then finally it really took off on January, I think it was the 28th. The real revolution started on the 25th of January, but it really felt like an actual revolution on the 28th, which is the first Friday. It's called the Friday of Rage, and that's when the protests really became something huge. It was really incredible to watch.
Oh yeah, I can't even imagine. And to be studying that as well, like literally watching history unfold as you were kind of studying some of the previous things, but like in real time. I imagine
Right.
that was a fascinating experience.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about your three main characters. And so you kind of gave us a little bit about them, and they come from backgrounds that are different from your own. They're not American, they have different ages, different genders, different nationalities, amongst other things as well. So how did it feel to write folks who were really different from your own experience?
I think in some ways it was obviously harder, but in other ways it was easier because I think I'm like more self-conscious if I'm writing about a character that is kind of similar to me. I think you kind of like allow yourself more freedom when it's somebody who just like has nothing to do with you. And then you kind of like pick up on things that like you actually are similar to that character with. And you see yourself in little details about this character that you originally didn't envision that way. Um, so I prefer actually writing about characters that are totally different from myself, even though it requires a lot of research. And of course, like there are things that you will never be able to capture as somebody who doesn't come from a specific background. Um, it's just kind of interesting. I feel like in a way it like gives a more nuanced portrait of like a character's personality. Um, just seeing the kind of like unexpected natural ways that their character comes out.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And certainly we're all human. And we all come with like different experience and different pasts that, kind of show up in how we act every day and how we respond to stressful moments. And so, yeah, thank you. Thank you for explaining that. It's definitely really interesting to think about how that would feel really different from your own experience, but also be surprisingly similar along the way. That's great. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and so kind of speaking of this moment, so we're recording this in July of 2020, kind of in the midst of the Black Lives Movement and COVID-19. And so I was wondering, having watched kind of so much unrest happen in Egypt, are there lessons that you learned either from your time there or in terms of like as you wrote the book and thinking about the book through this kind of fictional lens that you feel like applies to us right now?
Yeah, it's funny, like when we went on lockdown for COVID, my old roommates in Cairo, like we were messaging each other that it felt something like the revolution somehow. I didn't feel that way, but my roommates did. It just felt like this kind of weird, like collective emergency. Um, so it had that kind of in common. But um, yeah, it's kind of similar in that you feel like you're living like a really unprecedented period of time. You feel like you're living history, and not necessarily in a good way for when it comes to COVID. I mean, definitely not in a good way, but I mean, it has that in common with my feeling from that time in Egypt. Um, and then Black Lives Matter, definitely. I mean, I definitely don't want to make it seem like they are um, in any way like equivalent, because obviously like the context is totally different for both. There's like really different dynamics at play, but I sense like the same kind of spirit in it, where it's just like a very organic and raw expression of anger, of people, like people's lives are at stake, and I think in both situations, and you really sense that it's not really like your typical organized protest, which is kind of lame and like unimpressive. Like it's just a really like organic and powerful movement. And I think that one lesson that I learned from Egypt is that you have to strike while the iron is hot. Like now is the time, like while there's all this energy around something, like that's the time to kind of like really push for reforms and change. Because if you wait, you can't wait. If you put it off, like people will forget about it, interest will wane, you know. I think like now you really have to like capitalize on a moment where everybody is paying attention. So I think that's one lesson I learned from Egypt.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing some of those similarities and, yeah, some of those lessons learned. That's great. And so, my last question, so spring is due out in August of 2020. So, how are you planning to celebrate the release of your very first book?
I have no idea. Because I think like none of us really know what the world is going to look like then. I guess it's 2 months from now. Um, but yeah, I really don't know what to expect. I kind of, I mean, it's kind of sad, but I'm kind of expecting like an underwhelming debut just because of the situation. Like, probably won't be as many in-person events. But you know, I really have no idea what to expect.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. You know, it is amazing how like yes, from one month to the next, it's almost like one world to the next here in this timeline that we're in. Well, yeah, and I thank you for putting up with one more Zoom call through our
Yes.
conversation, and hopefully, you know, readers who are watching, please do check out Spring. Let Leila Rafei know what you think of the book so that it's a really big, fantastic celebration. So that, you know, even we're all in our islands, that we can be connected through reading and through this great book. And Leila Rafei, thank you so very much for both writing Spring and for taking the time to speak with me about it today.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me.